First of all, I'd like to say that our views are our own, and we don't represent the views of Yale University, Yale Law School, or Yale School of Medicine. My name is Dr. Bandy Lee. I am a forensic psychiatrist working at the interface of psychiatry and the law, and an expert on violence at Yale School of Medicine. I have been co-teaching courses at the law school since 2003, including immigration, legal services, criminal justice clinic, veterans clinic, among other things. And this session has been sponsored by former Dean Robert Post, who is a champion for speech among medical experts. He has written the book Democracy, Expertise, and Academic Freedom. And we will hold a discussion that starts with some of the ethical aspects, some legal perspective on the usefulness of expertise, and then the cultural aspects of speaking up. First, let me introduce one of the speakers, Attorney Richard Painter, who is a professor of corporate law at the University of Minnesota. He served as Chief White House Ethics Counsel under the Bush administration from 2005 to 2007. He is also the founding board member of Take Back Our Republic, working on campaign finance reform, and is currently litigating an emoluments case with CREW, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. And then our next speaker will be Dr. Kevin Washington, who is a psychologist and head of the Psychology and Sociology Department at Grambling State University. He is the immediate past president of the Association of Black Psychologists and creator of what is called Ubuntu psychotherapy, bringing in African and African-American principles to treatment. And he will be speaking about culture and mental health.
We have a long history in the human experience of dealing with leaders, people in elected positions as well as in unelected positions, who have had one type of mental illness or another, and it has had an impact on human society, and mental illness of high-ranking officials in different ways at different times. I could go through the different Roman emperors who have had, according to accounts, contemporary accounts, one mental illness or another. I wouldn't want to take too long with that, but I'll point to the fact that Emperor Nero, if he's anything like what Tacitus said he was like, the Roman historian Tacitus, if Nero was anything like what Tacitus said he was an extreme narcissist, among other things. And indeed, taking Tacitus's account of Nero at face value, I have a co-authored book with Peter Golenbach coming out next February with the title American Nero. And I have a bust of the Roman emperor. Well, no, we have the face of a certain American president there on that bust instead of the Roman emperor. And Nero's narcissism had a severe impact on life in the Roman Empire at the time, and other Roman emperors as well. More recently, we have King George III, who was mentally deranged, and British historians and psychiatrists and psychologists have looked at his correspondence and contemporary accounts of the behavior of King George III and have found severe mental illness at times. The last 10 to 15 years of his reign with the so-called regency, his son actually had to take over. But it was a serious problem much earlier than that, and indeed his narcissism was a factor in how he responded to the situation in the American colonies in the 1770s, when he sought to impose taxes on the colonists to force them to consume the East India Company tea and pay taxes on that, and passed the Tea Act of 1773, and then his visceral reaction when the Bostonians heaved the tea into Boston Harbor. It was quite obvious it was about King George's ego, and he sided with the hawks in his cabinet and the Parliament, who urged him to take military action, and military action in the American Revolution, which he eventually lost. He did not listen to people like Edmund Burke and others who cautioned against such rash actions. But a lot of it was about his psychological condition, his narcissism. And so the play, The Madness of King George, which was popular on Broadway a number of years ago, certainly has some grains of truth to it. In the United States, we've had presidents with varying types of mental illnesses or mental conditions that we might treat differently today than we would have at the time. President Abraham Lincoln suffered from severe depression. There is not evidence that his depression substantially interfered with his ability to perform his functions in office. And I think it's important to point that out, because simply because someone has a condition which one might describe as a mental illness in need of treatment doesn't mean that person cannot perform the duties of high office. And President Lincoln was in many ways our greatest president, even though he suffered from depression. And we've had people more recently, including United States senators I know, who have had a history of depression, have dealt with it, or alcoholism. President Bush had a history of struggling with alcohol, dealt with it, went on to become president of the United States. So mental illness or mental conditions should not be a disqualifier for public office, and that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a case-by-case analysis of what the mental condition is and what the official duties are and what the impact is or could be. Another president who had, toward the end of his life, mental impairment was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the president in the First World War. It promised not to get us into the war, but then we got into the war, and he wanted to have a lasting peace, negotiated the Treaty of Versailles, and then went all over the country trying to persuade people to back him and getting the Senate to ratify the treaty, including the League of Nations. And he exhausted himself. He had a stroke. Woodrow Wilson was taken back to the White House, was bedridden, and was not capable of making the decisions that need to be made by a president. It was unclear who was in charge, although a lot of people thought that Mrs. Wilson, the First Lady, was in charge of a lot of what was going on, because she was on very good terms with the cabinet members and the White House officials. But it was a very bad situation for almost 2 years, until he left office in March of 1921, when Warren Harding succeeded him. Woodrow Wilson had an Attorney General Palmer, who was out of control and rounding people up who he thought were communists. And it was a so-called Red Scare. And Attorney General Palmer was going after principally Jews and Italians, saying they were communists. And it was as much an anti-immigrant raid as really an effort to really go after communists. And no one was stopping it in the White House. There were no brakes put on Attorney General Palmer, other than the Labor Secretary, who at the time immigration was under the Labor Department. The Labor Secretary tried to stop it, and it created a major controversy. But here we had a severe impairment of civil liberties in this country by the Attorney General of the United States, not because of the President's orders, but because of the inability of the President of the United States to give him orders to stop. And so if the President is not in charge, well, then the cabinet officials, including the Attorney General, pretty much do whatever they want. And that was a very bad situation during the Red Scare there in 1919, 1920, early 21. Till, as I say, Warren Harding took over in 21, and some of that even continued after in his presidency. More recently than that, with the nuclear weapons, people are very concerned about what happens if you have a president who's lost it, to use a slang for describing mental illness, which slang I probably shouldn't use, but that was the way ordinary Americans would view it. You know, we need to do something, because what if you had somebody who literally went nuts with nuclear weapons? What could happen? We could destroy the world. And it became that much more real in the fall of 1962, when President Kennedy had to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Russians had put installations there in Cuba for missiles, and we saw them on the satellite, and then they sent the other missiles over on ships, and we knew those ships were approaching Cuba. Now what are you going to do? Do you blow up the missile silos in Cuba so there's no place for those missiles to land? Do you blow up the Russian ships? Well, either one of those options could have led to World War III. Or Kennedy came up with a plan of having a blockade, and then to keep the ships from coming in, and then he actually pulled the blockade back a little bit, and then Khrushchev eventually chickened out. But you had a president who was on top of it, on top of his own emotions, in an extremely scary situation. And not only on top of his own emotions, but understanding the psychology of the person who he's dealing with, the adversary, Secretary Khrushchev. And that was critically important. That could have gone the other way. And if it had gone the other way, we wouldn't be here today. I was 1 year old at the time, and living in Philadelphia, and I'm sure the city of Philadelphia would have been blown sky high, along with Moscow and New York and Boston and so forth. So people started to think about what would it be like if you had a president who was completely out of control in one way or another, or who lost capacity, such as Woodrow Wilson did, and then some general who's out of control gets a hold of the nuclear weapons, or a defense secretary. We need some way to deal with this. Then a couple of years later, President Kennedy had been killed, and President Johnson was in charge, and he was up against Barry Goldwater. And that's where this whole Goldwater rule thing came up, because there were concerns about some of the things Barry Goldwater said about the extremism and the defense of liberty, and it wasn't just that speech, a whole bunch of things he had said that concerned people about whether he was psychologically fit to deal with something like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's what's so important to remember. It's not just about the psychological condition of the person, but what is the situation they're dealing with. And you might say that a president is psychologically sound in one situation, but if they're in a Cuban Missile Crisis, you might want to take them out of action. They might not be able to handle something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, given the psychological condition of the president. You don't know. And we were arguing about that in the context of the 1964 election. Now, what you had going on there is a lot of psychologists were weighing in, and it's a question of what should the standard be? Is the burden of proof that you got to prove that the president, the person who's running for office even, is psychologically unfit? Or, what happens if we get it wrong and we have someone in control of the nuclear weapons who is psychologically unfit? Well, we won't be around to answer that question. I mean, so the downside is enormous here from getting it wrong. And that's why a lot of psychologists weighed in, or some did, about Barry Goldwater. It just wasn't worth the risk for them. And there was a visceral reaction in the field of psychiatry. At the time, the medical profession was heavily Republican. And this is before the Republican Party got into tried to bring government into medical ethics with abortion and contraception issues, where the Republican side with the religious right, a lot of doctors went the other way. But this is before that, and a lot of doctors in the United States were Republicans, psychiatrists included. And, there was also a feeling we got to stay out of politics. And there was the campaign finance was another topic I write on. That came in there because the Lyndon Johnson's people, of course, made a TV ad about it. And that was the first blockbuster TV ad, was Daisy Girl, where they had a girl picking daisies in a field, and then suddenly there was a nuclear mushroom in the background. And, it's like, do you want to vote for Goldwater? No, vote for LBJ. So the money in politics and the TV ads were coming in, and there was some fear-mongering on Lyndon Johnson's side that wasn't based in science at all. It was just based in politics, taking advantage of what the psychiatrists were saying. So that they get the Goldwater rule as a reaction to that. But the Goldwater rule, I think, is a fundamental infringement on the not only the right but the duty of any American to speak up when there's a threat to our liberty, a threat to public safety, including a man or a woman in charge of our nuclear weapons who could be a danger to human civilization. And so the Goldwater rule is a very unfortunate consequence of what happened there in 1964. Well, a few years later, though, Congress went the other way and said we actually there is a potential problem. And what if you had a president who was psychologically deranged or physically incapacitated to the point that he couldn't perform his duties, such as Woodrow Wilson after the stroke? Would you want just a defense secretary taking over? I mean, what are we going to do in this situation? So Congress they passed through both houses the 25th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which then was ratified by 3/4 of the states. And once again, this is something that's relatively easy to sell to the public. I mean, you got a crazy man with the nukes. We got to be able to get him out of there. It was not like trying to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, equal rights for women. I guess a little more difficult to get 3/4 of the states on board with that. But this went through. The 25th Amendment is part of the Constitution. So theoretically, it provides a roadmap for temporarily or permanently removing a president who is psychologically unfit for office. And that's going to depend on the president's psychological conditions and also what the duties of the office are at the time. You could have a temporary removal, maybe in a Cuban Missile Crisis type situation, and then maybe put the president back in when the duties weren't so mentally challenging for this particular president. It all depends on the context. Well, the problem with 25th Amendment is it provides for two tracks. One is the default track, which is in there now, which is that the 25th Amendment is triggered by the vice president, and the president's cabinet, the majority of the cabinet, deciding that the 25th Amendment shall be invoked because the president is physically or mentally incapacitated, at least temporarily. And that removes the president temporarily from his duties, but then it goes over to the House and Senate, and they would have to vote affirmatively in favor of continuing to keep the president out temporarily, or if necessarily permanently relieving the president of his or her duties and having the vice president succeed. But that's the default track in the 25th Amendment. Has to start with the cabinet and the vice president, majority of the cabinet, and then go to the Congress. The alternative track is that Congress could, in place of using the cabinet, set up another body that would evaluate the president's intellectual, that is psychological conditions or physical health or combination of the two, and then make recommendations to Congress, and then Congress could act and remove the president temporarily or permanently from his or her duties. Not necessarily having to take this recommendation, but it could be a panel consisting of experts, it could be a panel consisting of past presidents. I mean, there are a range of different options. But Congress would have to, by statute, create the panel. And if we're going to use that alternative route instead of the cabinet. So the cabinet, that's the default route, that's what we've got, because Congress has never enacted a law to create this alternative panel for review of the president's mental and physical fitness for office. So what do we have? We've got a cabinet which won't act because Donald Trump, our current president, has made sure that anybody who questions the fact that he is a stable genius, whatever a stable genius is sent packing. The Secretary of State, Mr. Tillerson, was told to go. I think he may have called the president a moron somewhere. That's definitely disqualifying. And the attorney general is gone. A whole bunch of cabinet members have been told to leave, and a lot of them because of the questions about their loyalty to Donald Trump. So we are now in a situation where the 25th Amendment of the United States Constitution is not working well. Over the long term, the plan ought to be that Congress enact legislation setting up the expert panel that would advise the House and the Senate. The House and the Senate, of course, retain the power to decide what to do. I described that in the last chapter of this book in an essay with Norman Eisen. This is the book Mandy Lee edited, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, and how that legislation might work. In the meantime, we're stuck with what we've got, and so this is an issue that the American people will need to address in the upcoming elections. If the Republican Party chooses to renominate President Trump, and given that he's fixed the primaries, I guess that's the way it's going to go. And it's critically important that every American weigh in with whatever opinions they have. It's your right under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And it's your obligation as a member of the psychiatric profession, if you believe that this president is not psychologically fit to hold office, and in particular to control our nuclear arsenal in times of international tension, it's your obligation to say so. And I would say that any organization that seeks to tell you what you could say and what you cannot say about a public figure is seeking to infringe on your First Amendment rights, and does infringe on your First Amendment rights if state action is tied to the opinions of that organization. And that means that, for example, the state of Connecticut were to deny you a license to practice psychiatry, or to in any way compromise your license because you're violating the opinions of such an organization, that would be wrong. That would be unconstitutional, in violation of the First Amendment. And the same, the state of Connecticut would not give you a contract because the American Psychiatric Association or any other private organization that wants you not to criticize the president is telling you to keep your mouth shut. That's just not the country we live in. We have an obligation, we have a right to speak. And I thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
In talking about organizations that have spoken out against the government, I am proud to have been the president of the Black Psychologists, and so there was in the ethics of ABPSI, there's responsibility, restraint, respect, reciprocity, commitment, courage, and corporations and accountability. It is on this concept of courage, I think, that is very critical to note, because the organization took a stance and said that it would be unethical for black psychologists to not speak out on political issues, and that in part comes from a population that had suffered tremendously from laws that sanctioned the inhumane treatment of a population. When you have the situation where people are in a space where it is a public specter to suggest that they are less than human, then their perception or the lens through which they see a phenomenon is very distinct. And so the organization, as well as the Latino Psychological Association and Black nurses and others, started in the 60s, around the time that you were talking about their last Goldwater discourse, to address issues of a nation state, dehumanizing a population. And so in doing due diligence around the history, again, of psychiatry and psychology, we noticed that Benjamin Rush, who was the father of American psychiatry in the 1700s, suggested that there was a population that suffered from nigritude. They were of African descent, and that the way to cure them would be to turn their skins white. So the discipline itself is grounded in the ideology that there is this notion of white superiority or supremacy, and so to turn the person to the superior color is the way to heal them. Also, G. Stanley Hall, who's credited with being the father of American psychology, suggested that Chinese, Native Americans, and African Americans or blacks were a member of adolescent races, and so they had not developed psychologically as other groups. At around the same time, you had Lewis Terman and others with the human betterment movement determining who should be sterilized. And so there was this idea coming from Galton and Herbert Spencer and Darwin suggesting that there was a superior stock of individuals and that one should use science to determine who should procreate and who should not have children. It is important to know that even though that was in the early 1900s, that was still used as sterilization laws throughout the United States, where many black women in the 60s and 70s would actually go to medical professionals for appendicitis and come out with hysterectomies and not knowing that they had done so, and it was called the Mississippi appendectomy, where women's sexual organs were removed. And it's critical to note that because at one point the reproductive organs were utilized as cash crop in the country for population to engage in labor. And so we have then this ideology of superiority and supremacy that has been a part of the country, and at the same time it is a part of the ideology that the 45th president is utilizing. And we suggest then, I won't say we, me, that racism is a mental disorder and that he represents some level of this idea of the mental disorder, but it's not just with him. It is a cultural phenomenon that has to be addressed. And so I am excited to be a part of a project and a process where people are addressing the issue boldly with courage, not cowering, suggesting that there is something that needs to be handled. And so I commend you, Dr. Lee and Mr. Painter, for making sure that the voices are heard around the dynamics of the law and the psychiatry, as well as the work that has been done in psychology, to say that there's something that needs to be addressed in all of us. And so my grandmother would always say is that there's some good in the worst of us and some bad in the best of us, so it behooves none of us to judge any of us. So we know that everybody has to come to the table and be accountable. And so thank you for calling us to the table to be accountable. Thank you.
So we'd like to thank Yale Law School for allowing us to have this discussion among legal professionals, and we're happy to welcome Yale Law School graduate class of '87, Richard Painter and Dr. Kevin Washington, who came from Louisiana, and we will have a discussion off camera in order to protect student discourse. Thank you very much.